The envelope had been sitting on Edward Calloway's desk for 11 days before he opened it. It had arrived by registered mail, forwarded from his attorney's office, which was the only reason he had not discarded it with the rest of the week's correspondence. His assistant had flagged it with a yellow post-it note that read simply, "Personal. Hand-delivered original." Edward had moved it twice, once to the corner of the desk, once beneath a contract binder, without opening it. He could not have explained, even to himself, why, on the 11th day, a Tuesday in late November, he opened it. Inside was a single photograph. Not a printout, a developed photograph. The kind people stopped making decades ago. Its edges slightly soft with age. It showed a woman standing in a garden he recognized immediately. The east garden of his own estate. The one with the stone fountain that his father had commissioned in 1987 and that hadn't worked properly since the winter of 2003. The woman in the photograph was young, perhaps 30, and she was laughing at something outside the frame, her head turned slightly to one side. She wore a pale blue dress. She had her hand raised as though she had just caught something from the air, or was about to. He had never seen this woman before in his life. Behind the photograph was a single sheet of paper. No heading, no salutation. 6 lines, typed. Her name is Margaret Ellison. She has worked in your home for 9 years. She cleans your west wing every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. She has done so without complaint, without a sick day, without ever once asking for anything she was not owed. You have never spoken to her. That is your loss, Mr. Calloway. Look more carefully. No signature. Edward sat with the letter for a long time. Then he stood, straightened his tie in the way he had done every day for 40 years, and walked downstairs to find Margaret Ellison. He did not find her. She was not in the West Wing. Her shift had ended at 3. He asked his head housekeeper, Mrs. Ida Thornton, who had run the domestic staff of Calloway House for the last 16 years, with the competence of a general and the discretion of a confessor. Ida looked at him for a moment with an expression he could not quite read, then said, very evenly, "Margaret Ellison, sir. She's been here 9 years." "I know," Edward said. He did not know. "I'd like to speak with her. She comes Mondays, Wednesdays, and Fridays. She'll be here the day after tomorrow." He nodded. He went back upstairs. He put the photograph in his desk drawer and sat there until the light outside the window changed from afternoon to evening, and he thought about a woman laughing in his garden in a photograph he had never seen, and about the 9 years that had apparently passed in his own house without his knowing who was inside it. The thing about Edward Calloway was that he had not always been this man. The man he had become, precise and closed, operating his life from behind the professional distance of an executive who had learned to confuse control with safety, was not the man he had been at 35 or at 40. Grief does that. Sometimes it does not announce itself as a transformation. It arrives as a series of small decisions that each seem reasonable on their own. I will not go into that garden today, because today is not the day for it. I will not speak to that member of staff about anything personal, because there is nothing personal left to speak about. I will keep the house exactly as it is, because changing it would require me to acknowledge that it has been changed already, by something I cannot undo. Each decision is a door, and each door, once closed, makes the next closing slightly easier. And after 8 years you find that you are living inside a set of rooms that have no windows left, and you have arranged it that way. And you have called it composure. His wife, Caroline, had died 8 years ago. Breast cancer, diagnosed late, progressed quickly, over inside 14 months. He had sat beside her through every stage of it with the particular terrible attentiveness of a man who understands that there is nothing useful he can do and refuses to accept it. He had read to her when she wanted to be read to. He had sat in silence when silence was what she needed. He had said everything he needed to say while she was alive and present enough to hear it, which was a gift he had not known at the time to be grateful for, but which he was grateful for now, in the way you are grateful for things you almost lost without knowing you had them. She had loved the East Garden specifically, had planted 3 of the rose bushes herself in the spring before she got sick, had sat beside the broken fountain on the mornings when she had enough energy to go outside. Edward had not been into the East Garden since the autumn of the year she died. He had not removed the 3 rose bushes. He had not had the fountain repaired. He had simply closed the door on that part of the house and the part of himself that corresponded to it. And he had continued. He was not a cruel man. He was not, by most measures, an unkind one. He employed 12 people on the estate and paid them fairly and left their management entirely to Ida, which was its own kind of abdication. Benign, well-resourced, and entirely blind to the human lives operating within 10 meters of his own. He simply operated now, from a very long distance, from everything that was not work. And he had been operating from that distance for long enough that it had begun to feel like the natural order of things rather than a choice he had made and could, theoretically, unmake. Margaret Ellison arrived on Wednesday morning at 7:45. Edward was waiting in the hallway outside the West Wing, which was not something he had ever done in the 9 years she had apparently been coming to his house, because he was usually in his study by 7 with his first call of the day already underway. He stood in the hallway with his hands behind his back, and he waited. She came through the side entrance with a canvas bag over one shoulder and her dark coat half-buttoned, in the manner of someone who had walked quickly from the bus stop and had not quite finished composing themselves by the time they arrived. She was perhaps 55, he could not have said with any precision, because he was realizing now that he had developed, without intending to, an almost complete inability to look at the people who worked in his house. She had gray-streaked hair worn in a low braid and a quality of movement that was unhurried and deliberate, as though she had long ago decided how much energy each thing in her day was worth, and had not revisited those calculations since. She saw him in the hallway and stopped. She did not look frightened. She looked, instead, like a woman who had been expecting something for a while and had decided in advance not to be surprised by it when it arrived. "Mr. Calloway," she said. "Mrs. Ellison," he said. He had not known, until this moment, whether she was married. The name, he thought. The name told him, and the slight way she held herself when he said it, steady but with a stillness in it that went deeper than composure. "I'd like to speak with you," he said. "When you have a moment. There's no urgency." "Of course," she said. And then she walked past him and into the West Wing, because she had work to do, and 9 years of doing it had apparently not diminished her commitment to finishing the morning shift before anything else happened. He found that he could not fault this. He went back to his study. She knocked on the study door at 10:43, which he supposed was when the West Wing was done. He asked her to sit. She sat with her bag on her knees and her hands folded over it, and she looked at him across the desk with the particular attention of a person who has spent years being invisible in rooms, and therefore learned to observe them very accurately. He put the photograph on the desk between them. He watched her face. Nothing moved in it that he could read. She looked at the photograph for a long moment, then back at him. "Someone sent this to me," he said, "with a letter. It said you've worked here for 9 years. That's correct," she said. "And that I've never spoken to you." A pause. Also correct, He did not know what he had expected her to say. He did not know what he had expected at all, coming out of his study to stand in the hallway for the first time in a decade. He said, "The photograph was taken in my east garden. I don't know who took it, or when, or why someone sent it to me." Margaret Ellison was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I can tell you who took it, if you'd like." He waited. "Your wife took it," she said, "the summer before she died. I used to help in the garden those last months, when Ida needed extra hands on the mornings your wife wanted to go outside. She took that photograph herself. She gave it to me afterward and said she'd taken it because she thought I looked happy, and that there wasn't enough evidence of happiness in the world, so she was going to document it wherever she found it." She paused. She was a lovely woman. "Mr. Calloway. I'm sorry I only knew her for a short time." Edward looked at the photograph for a long moment. His wife had taken it. Caroline had held this camera, looked through the viewfinder, chosen this moment of a woman laughing in their garden, and decided it was worth keeping. And she had given it to Margaret, not to him. Given it to the woman in the photograph, not to her husband. Perhaps because she knew her husband would not know what to do with a photograph of a stranger's happiness, or perhaps because she had given him other things instead, other instructions in the months when she knew her time was arranging itself into its final shape, and this was simply one thing she had given elsewhere. "She asked me something," Margaret said. "Before she died, she asked me to keep working here. She said you would need the house to continue being the house, and that would require people who cared about it." She paused again. "I said I would. I've kept that. But I want you to know that I understood, when I agreed, that you might not know I was here. She told me you were going through your own process." Her words. The room was very quiet. "She asked you to stay," Edward said. "She asked me to stay." He sat with this for a long time, long enough that Margaret, who had clearly decided that this conversation would proceed at whatever pace he required, simply waited without discomfort. "Mrs. Ellison," he said finally, "I would like to know who you are." She looked at him steadily. Then she said, "You would need to be more specific, Mr. Calloway. There's rather a lot of it." It took him 3 weeks to learn most of it, not because she was evasive. She was not, once she understood he was genuinely asking, but because the shape of Margaret Ellison's life did not yield to a single conversation. It arrived in pieces, the way real things do, across the 3 mornings a week when he began making a point of being downstairs when she arrived, of bringing 2 cups of tea to the kitchen table before she started her shift, of sitting across from her and asking a question, or saying nothing, depending on what the morning seemed to call for. She had been a teacher, secondary school English, 17 years, at a school that served one of the poorer districts of the city. She spoke of those 17 years without nostalgia and without bitterness. She spoke of them the way people speak of something they gave themselves to, genuinely and completely, which is always a different quality of speech from the kind that comes from obligation. She had known her students, she said. She had read their first drafts and their rewritten drafts, and she had learned, over time, which students needed to be challenged and which needed to be steadied, and she had become good at knowing the difference. She had left not because she had failed at it, but because she had a son, Thomas, 23 now, studying civil engineering at the university, who had needed her home more in his early teenage years than the school had needed her there. She had made the calculation that most people with children make at some point, choosing the smaller life over the larger one without drama or self-pity, and she had cleaned houses because cleaning houses was honest work she could do on hours that fit around Thomas's school day. Her husband, James Ellison had died when Thomas was 9. A car accident. Winter Road. Insufficient stopping distance. Gone in an evening, which is the most brutal arithmetic life can do. A man alive, and then not alive. A family complete, and then not complete. With nothing in the space between those two states except a phone call and a sound she had not known she was capable of making. She had raised Thomas alone after that, in a house she kept by working 3 cleaning jobs simultaneously for the first 4 years, until she was established enough to reduce to 2, then 1. Callaway House had been her one remaining position for the last 6 years. She came 3 mornings a week, and she did the work well, and she went home. She had never mentioned any of this to anyone who worked in the house. She had not hidden it. She had simply not offered it, because no one had asked, and she had not been raised to speak at length about herself to people who had not indicated they wanted to hear it. Ida knew some of it. Ida knew most things, but Ida, for all her considerable intelligence, had understood that this was not her story to tell. My mother used to say. Margaret told Edward one Wednesday morning, sitting across from him at the kitchen table with her tea going cold because she had been talking, and she looked mildly surprised to notice this, and continued anyway, that the life you carry on the inside doesn't need to advertise itself. She said, just do the work. Be the thing you believe you should be, and let the rest of it arrange itself. She paused. She was right, mostly, although I think she would also agree that it helps if, occasionally, someone asks. He looked at her. I should have asked 9 years ago. You had other things to carry, she said. It was not a consolation or an absolution, it was simply a fact, stated without judgment, by a woman who had learned the difference between those 3 things, and applied that knowledge carefully. Charlotte Voss had been watching all of this from a very specific kind of distance. Charlotte was Edward's sister, younger by 4 years, formidably organized, owner of a public relations firm that occupied the top 2 floors of a building downtown. She had come to dinner at Callaway House the first Wednesday of every month for 11 years, which meant she had sat at the same table as the domestic arrangements of her brother's home for that entire period, without once taking genuine stock of them. It was Charlotte who had, 18 months ago, made a casual remark to Margaret, who was serving that evening at Ida's request, about the East Garden roses needing to be replaced, because they were going untended, and it was a shame to let them die. She had said it with the breezy authority of someone who is accustomed to managing things, including things that do not belong to her. Margaret had said, very quietly and very directly, they're not dying. They need to be cut back in the spring, and they'll bloom again. Mrs. Callaway planted them. I suspect Mr. Callaway would want to make that decision himself. Charlotte had stared at her for a moment. Then she had left the room and gone to find Ida, and she had said, "Who is that woman?" And Ida had told her, and Charlotte had sat with what Ida told her for 18 months, and she had eventually sent a registered letter to her brother's attorney's office with a developed photograph inside it, and 6 lines typed on a single sheet of paper. She was not a sentimental woman. She was not given to grand gestures. But she knew her brother, and she knew that he would not find his way back to the East Garden on his own. She told Edward none of this until the following spring. She told him at dinner on the first Wednesday of April, while the roses that Margaret had cut back in late February were beginning, as Margaret had said they would, to come back. Edward listened to the whole account without interrupting. Then he said, "You sent the letter." "I did. You might have simply told me." Charlotte picked up her wineglass. "I might have. But you wouldn't have believed me. You needed to see for yourself." She looked at him over the rim. "That's always been your problem, Edward, and your saving grace, the same quality." He did not argue with this, because it was true. What Charlotte had understood, what Ida had known for years, in the particular way that people who run households understand the emotional weather of the people inside them, was that Margaret Ellison had been doing two things simultaneously for 9 years. She had been cleaning the house, and she had been quietly, invisibly maintaining it in another sense entirely, keeping the East Garden from becoming completely abandoned, pressing Ida to ensure the broken fountain was assessed by someone who knew about these things, speaking once to the groundskeeper about the roses, in a tone that had left him with the strong impression that the roses were a matter of principle rather than aesthetics, and that he should govern himself accordingly. She had done none of this because she was asked. She had done it because Caroline had asked her to stay, and she had understood, without being told and without requiring it to be spelled out, what staying meant. That is not a small understanding. Most people, given the instruction to stay in a house where no one noticed them, in a job that asked nothing of them beyond the mechanical repetition of tasks, would have stayed in exactly that way, mechanically, at the surface. Margaret had stayed in the deeper sense. She had stayed the way you stay with something that matters, attending to it, guarding it against the specific kind of damage that comes not from violence, but from neglect, from the slow withdrawal of care that happens when people are too inside their own pain to look outward. Charlotte had seen this over 11 years of monthly dinners and had not known what to do with it, until Ida told her about the roses, about Margaret's quiet word with the groundskeeper, about the way the East Garden had been kept from going entirely wild, without anyone ever formally authorizing the keeping of it. That was when Charlotte, who was not a sentimental woman and had never pretended to be, had sat down at her desk and written 6 lines on a sheet of paper, and enclosed them with a photograph that had been sitting in her own possession for 8 years, given to her by her sister-in-law in the last weeks of her life with the instruction, "When Edward is ready for it, you'll know. Don't send it before then." Charlotte had held the photograph for 8 years. She had looked at it sometimes, on evenings when she was working late and the office was quiet, and she had asked herself whether Edward was ready, and each time the answer had been not yet. Until the November when Ida told her about the roses, and she thought, now, he might be. In March, 6 months after the photograph arrived on Edward's desk, he had the fountain repaired. He told Margaret on a Wednesday morning, in the kitchen, over tea. He said, "I've arranged for the fountain to be repaired. I wondered if you might want to be there when they start it up again." It seemed like something Caroline would have wanted to be witnessed by someone who had known her. Margaret looked at him for a moment. Then she said, "Yes, I'd like that very much." They stood beside the fountain on a Thursday afternoon in late March, just the two of them, while the water came up through the stone basin with a sound like something exhaling after a long time of being held. The roses on the east wall were showing their first growth, small, bright, determined, pushing through the cutback he had never approved and she had arranged anyway, because 9 years of working in a house gives you certain convictions about what that house requires and what it deserves. The water ran clear. The sound of it filled the garden and then settled into the garden the way sounds settle when they belong somewhere. It was not a dramatic sound. It was simply water, moving the way water moves when nothing is preventing it, when the mechanism that was broken for so long has finally been attended to by someone who understood that broken things can be repaired if you are willing to look at them directly. Edward stood beside the fountain and did not speak for a long time. The light in the garden was the thin, clean light of early spring, not warm yet, but honest. The kind of light that shows you things exactly as they are rather than how you might prefer them to be. The rose bush nearest the fountain, the first one Caroline had planted, the oldest one, had 3 new stems coming from the base, pale green and upright. With the particular insistence of something that has survived a winter, it was not certain it would survive. Margaret stood beside him and did not fill the silence, because she had spent 9 years knowing the difference between silence that needs filling and silence that needs leaving alone. After a while, Edward said, "She would have been glad it's working again." "Yes," Margaret said. "She would." He stood there for another moment, listening to the water. "She loved this garden in the mornings," he said. "She used to say it was the most honest part of the house, that everything else could be arranged to look the way you wanted it to look, but a garden just showed you what it was." Margaret looked at the roses. She was right about that. He looked at them too. They were showing him what they were, what they had always been, underneath the years of being left without attention. Still there, still growing, still doing what roses do, which is come back. That was all that was said. It was enough. Some sentences are not a beginning or an end. They are the acknowledgement that something that mattered is still being held, still present, still real. That is a different and more important thing than resolution. Resolution says, "This is over." Acknowledgement says, "This was real, and it is still real, and you are not alone with it." The offer Edward made to Margaret came 2 months later, in May. He had thought about it carefully, which was the only way he knew how to do anything, and he had arrived at something specific. Because he had learned, with some difficulty and some help, that vague offers were for people who needed to feel generous without taking responsibility for the shape of their generosity. He asked her to take charge of the Callaway House Estate Program, a new initiative, formally established, designed to open the house and gardens to school groups from the district where Margaret had taught, free of charge, on a rotating schedule throughout the year. It would be called the Caroline Callaway Education Program. It would give Margaret a contract, a salary that reflected what 9 years of quiet care was actually worth, and the authority to design the program as she thought it should be designed, which was the only authority that meant anything. He also told her about the trust, the Caroline Callaway Memorial Garden Trust, established in his wife's name, funded from his estate, dedicated to the maintenance and restoration of historic private gardens that had been allowed to fall into disrepair, with a particular focus on gardens that had been planted by women and were at risk of being lost when those women were gone. It was the sort of thing Caroline would have found both moving and slightly too serious, and she would have said so while also being glad it existed. He knew that about her. He was glad, suddenly and sharply, that he still knew things about her, that 9 years of closing the aperture had not taken that from him. Margaret was quiet for a long time after he told her about the trust. Her hands were folded on the kitchen table between them, the way they always were when she was thinking carefully. She'd want it to be practical, Margaret said. She'd want it to actually restore things, not just document them. That was my intention. And she'd want the children from the school groups to be able to get their hands in the actual soil, not just walk around looking at it. Also my intention. Margaret nodded slowly. Then, she said, then I think she'd be glad. The first school group came in September. 11 children, ages 13 and 14, from the secondary school in the district where Margaret had taught for 17 years. They came through the gate of the East Garden in a loose, uncertain cluster, the way adolescents enter spaces they haven't been invited into before. And then they saw the fountain and heard it, and the cluster loosened into something more natural, and one of them, a girl with her school uniform half untucked and an expression of determined unimpressiveness, walked straight to the nearest rose bush and said, "Did someone plant these on purpose?" "Yes," Margaret said from behind her. "Someone planted them very much on purpose." Would you like to know who? The girl turned around. Margaret was standing in the autumn light of the East Garden. In the garden where Caroline Calloway had taken a photograph of her laughing at something outside the frame, and she was looking at this girl with the expression of a teacher who has not stopped being a teacher, regardless of what title she has held for the last several years. The expression that says, "I have something worth telling you, and I think you're worth telling it too." "Yes," the girl said. Edward watched from the doorway of the house. He had not intended to stay. He had a call at 11, and then a board meeting at 2, and the specific gravitational pull of the man he had been for the last 8 years was still considerable. But he stayed. He stood in the doorway of his own house, and he watched Margaret Ellison tell a 13-year-old girl with her uniform untucked about the woman who had planted the roses, and about what it means to plant something with the knowledge that you may not be there to see it bloom, and about the particular courage that requires, which is a different kind of courage from any other kind. He stayed until the school group left at 1 o'clock. Then he went inside and made his calls and attended his board meeting and did all the things he did every day. But he did them differently. Not dramatically differently. He was not a man given to dramatic differences. Just the small, irreversible difference of a person who has been reminded that the house they are standing in has other people in it, and that those people have been there all along, carrying their lives alongside his, without asking him to notice. He noticed now. If you have ever maintained something beautiful for someone who didn't know you were doing it, if you have ever stayed when leaving would have been so much easier, because someone asked you to, and because you understood what the asking meant, then you know exactly what kind of person Margaret Ellison is. You have met her, perhaps, in a different name, in a different house, in the particular quality of someone's presence that makes a place feel cared for even when no one is watching. That quality does not belong to any title or any wage. It is simply what some people do with their time and their attention and their refusal to let the things that matter come undone. Caroline Calloway knew it the moment she handed Margaret a developed photograph in the garden and said, "I took this because you looked happy." She knew what she was entrusting, and to whom. There are roses growing in the East Garden today, in the second spring since the fountain was restored. They bloom in the way roses bloom when someone has cut them back properly and given them room and not interfered with what they know how to do. The fountain runs. The water makes its sound, which is the sound of something long held returning to itself. The girl with the untucked uniform came back in April, outside the school program, on a Saturday, because she had thought of another question. She stood at the garden gate and rang the bell with the specific determination of a person who has decided that a gate is an invitation rather than an obstacle. Margaret opened it. The girl asked her question. It took 20 minutes to answer properly. When it was done, the girl looked at the rosebush nearest the fountain, the one Caroline had planted first, the oldest one, now nearly as tall as the east wall, and she said, "Do you think she knew they'd get this big?" Margaret looked at the rosebush. "Yes," she said. "I think she knew exactly." There is a photograph on the wall of the small office in the East Wing where the Caroline Calloway Education Program operates from. It is a developed photograph, the edges soft with age, showing a woman standing in a garden, laughing at something outside the frame. Beneath it, in a frame of the same simple wood, is a card in Caroline Calloway's own handwriting. It says, "There isn't enough evidence of happiness in the world. Document it wherever you find it." That is both the instruction and the legacy. The garden that keeps being tended. The fountain that keeps running. The woman who kept showing up, 3 mornings a week, for 9 years, because she had been asked to stay by someone who knew the difference between a house and a home, and had trusted her to help hold that difference in place until the person who lived there was ready to feel it again. He is ready now. The aperture is open. The east garden is full of light in the mornings, and the roses are in their second bloom, and on Mondays and Wednesdays and Fridays the side door opens at 7:45, and there are 2 cups of tea on the kitchen table by the time Margaret Ellison has finished hanging up her coat. That is what it means to finally see the person who has been in your house all along. Not a revelation, not a dramatic unmasking, just the ordinary, extraordinary act of looking at what has always been there and letting yourself understand what it is worth.